peasants. Let me tell you how it's gonna be done. You do what I say each and every day. You can reach a ripe old age of 21. Damn, it's good to have peasants. Without them, I couldn't be the 1%. I laugh when they call me medieval. Bitch, I take that as a compliment. Damn, it's good to have my peasants. My posable, disposable friends. If they're breaking their backs and kissing my ass, I probably won't be cutting off their hands, maybe. So all I got to say to you grumbling, mumbling serfs complaining I'm unpleasant, if you band together in democracy, I'll burn you at the fucking stake.
It is Wednesday, November 1st, 2017. This is the Dissident Peasant Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff the Dissident Peasant. On today's show, everyone, my interview with noted immigration attorney, hilarious comedian on the Majority Report, and host and producer of the Redirect podcast, Immigration Law and Perspectives, Stephen Robbins. Just recorded an interview with him. I hope you guys enjoy it. Just a bit of housekeeping before I start. I just want to say that from now on, the plan will be to put out new content Wednesday evenings / maybe really early Thursday mornings, depending on my schedule. I do work a full-time job at nights, but I think this is what I can swing, and I know consistency is important in these sorts of endeavors, so Wednesday evenings / Thursday mornings be when I put out new content. I would like the idea of doing a weekly roundup show. I don't have the time or the resources to do that. As usual, you can always go to dissidentpeasant.com to catch everything. Everything is there. If anything ever doesn't come through the Stitcher feed or YouTube or iTunes, you can always find everything at headquarters, dissidentpeasant.com. Without further ado, folks, here is my interview with Stephen Robbins.
Sick.
Cool, man. How are you doing?
Oligarchs.
That's what he said. That's what I said. That's obviously what our position is.
I'm good.
That sounds like an extremely innocent man. Everybody's just waiting around for Bob Mueller to tell him he's a crook. He's totally a crook.
The best part, so the audio is great. Don't get me wrong, but the visual is even better because he's so visually uncomfortable and clearly lying, right? Like, I'm not a lie doctor, but I mean 100%.
Yeah, like all the classic signs. He's like looking around and fidgeting and
shifting in his chair.
Yeah, you don't need to be a super scientist or a lie detector to know that guy is totally hiding something from you.
Found another video of him after the nomination, after the election, I guess I should say. And they ask him if he's involved still in the campaign, and he does the exact same thing. Like, he does this weird, shifty, no, I'm not involved at all. So, shady character, that Paulie M.
I mean, it's all kind of complicated, but near as I can tell, it looks like Paul Manafort was trying to do his Russian patrons a favor by becoming Trump's campaign manager, and he's probably the one responsible for that Ukraine stuff getting taken out of the platform of the GOP convention. And we have emails of him asking about, are we good now? And
I think it's clear that, for Trump, this is all just transactional. And that's why he probably still doesn't quite understand like what's going on. But I'm sure for him, it was just like, hey, we can grease the wheels a little bit on Trump Tower, Moscow. And, we just need you to, like, not do sanctions against us. And we're going to send this guy over here $70 million. And it was all like, we're just doing deals.
And he's rich compared to us. But I have a very strong suspicion Trump is extremely cash poor, or was.
Yeah, I think that's what people have been saying. I mean, It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, what kind of billionaire tries to sell steaks at the Sharper Image?
Exactly. Like no one with $1 billion is grifting somebody $1,000 to $10,000 at a time. That doesn't make any sense. Why would you bother?
Yeah, like slinging meats at the Sharper Image. Like somebody came to him and he was like, "This is a good idea. This is a good idea. Let's put my name on that." You know, it's just a bad branding moment for him. But anyways, yeah. So I think that that's basically what's going to end up coming out. That this stuff was all sort of very, transactional, and like, oh, you're going to help me get elected? Great. Like, what do I have to do for you? Okay. I can totally not sanction you and say that you can invade Ukraine.
Which he hasn't done, despite legislation being passed. He hasn't lifted a finger to enforce it.
That seems like one of the sort of underreported angles in all of this is that, especially given their spin is that Russia was doing him dirty via the Clinton campaign. And you would think if that was like your actual position, that you would do something about it, that you'd be like, hey, what the hell? Like, these guys tried to do me dirty, and now I'm going to definitely do sanctions against you. And instead, it's like, can you believe Russia got involved and did all this stuff against me? And by the way, I'm not going to impose the sanctions that Congress passed. It's weird. The whole thing's weird. There's this moment I always talk about from early on. Bill O'Reilly did this interview, I think not long after Trump announced. He did this interview with Trump where he's like, Putin, this is O'Reilly. He's like, Putin, he's a bad guy. And Trump's like, well, he's tough, whatever. And O'Reilly says he shot down a passenger plane. And Trump goes, well, he did what he had to do. It's like,
yeah, whatever it takes for the motherland. Ooh.
It's like, and then there's kind of some crosstalk almost like right on top of it. So that moment gets lost. But in any other campaign in history, a candidate going to those apologetic lengths, for this, for another country, like, well, sometimes you got to shoot down a passenger plane.
I mean, that's just one step beyond torturing for the nation, right? I think.
Right.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you. I don't want to talk about Russia the whole time, but this is something that I worry about. I'm not so afraid of the Russians. I don't think they're an all-powerful force. They're certainly not as powerful as they were during the height of the Cold War. But the fact that we are so vulnerable to this really pretty ham-handed propaganda by Russians in Russian interests makes me worry about the health of our democracy. It's like they have a cold virus, and our immune system is so sick in this country that we can't fight it off.
Right. I mean, it's the problem is, when you have a guy win by losing, the popular vote, and he wins by virtue, at least in part, of these sorts of tactics, you're not going to have a lot of like political will there to go about fixing like these issues. Like, for example, like, how is it that we have hackable voting machines? It should be paper. We should have paper ballots with a verification system or whatever, or at least have backup paper ballots. Or, yeah, like, why is it that foreign countries can come in and spend millions of dollars on ads or even just money in politics? But unfortunately, there's just no, when you win dirty, what are the chances that you're going to go in and try and clean up the process? Like, basically zero. So, yeah, I don't know. It's definitely a concern. And I've thought about that leading up to 2018, because that's like the big hope, right? Like, we're going to take back the house and we're going to finally have a check on this guy. But, it doesn't seem totally out of the question that they would just go full, authoritarian, basically mock election and
right.
And
I think everyone should think about it this way. It is entirely possible that the Democratic Party will never control any branch of the federal government ever again.
Yeah, well, I mean, who knows, right? I mean,
we don't know, but that could happen. Elections might not be a pathway to change in this country anymore.
Yeah, if you think about it, actually, Trump's got this voter election fraud committee. So they've got a committee, and it's full of people who have some qualifications, like on the face of it. And what are they doing? They're trying to figure out how to get black people off the polls. We need a bipartisan voter fraud commission, and we need it well staffed. And there's like so much work to do. And when you see that the commission exists and the type of work that we need to be done is not being done, and not only that, but they're doing the opposite type of work, then I think, it's not totally illegitimate to say what you just said and to have those type of concerns.
I'm not trying to be alarmist, and I'm not there yet. I wouldn't put the odds at better than a coin flip, but it is possible that, if we start a war in Korea or Iran and we lose, because we will, the authoritarian regime that will come following that loss, in order to suppress political dissent, will be a lot worse than now.
I don't think that you even need to lose a war. Like, look at the thing that really troubles me is the fake news thing, because it's one thing to hear it from this doofus on, the president. He's just an idiot, and you and I kind of know that. But then I listen to my local talk radio, and this stuff is filtering down, like, into the minds of regular people who should know better. And we now have a sizable chunk of the population that doesn't trust at all the New York Times, Washington Post. And I'm not saying those are institutions that have their flaws, but what I'm seeing on my local talk radio is that they will go straight to gatewaypundit.com, like a website that's clearly some bullshit. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
they'll post a Super Bowl parade and say it was a Trump rally, or they'll doctor. They're literally. It's like what was the Weekly World News or one of those tabloids growing up, where there was like the National Enquirer, which was sort of smutty celebrity stuff, but then there was this like the Bat Boy one.
Yeah, or Aliens a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was just like, this isn't even Photoshop. Somebody like cut out a bad drawing and whatever. We are now like in the Weekly World News of politics, where these people, I called in one day because I hate my life and I like to suffer. And I said, you've been citing the Gateway Pundit all morning, and that's not a reliable source of information. You owe it to your viewers to like explain where you're getting this information. And they said, oh, well, where would you get your news? And I said, well, again, it's not perfect, but you could start with the Washington Post. And they laughed at me.
Right.
And so, what that means is at this point, politically, like, nothing is real. If this voting commission says we need to purge all the voting rolls because fraud, at least half of the country, or almost half of the country, is going to be like, okay, that's a real thing. And he just hasn't. I don't know what you do about that, and that does keep me up at night.
I think some of those people need to be written off in a purely macro sense. I live among a lot of those types of people.
Yeah, me too. You and I actually probably live in very similar demographic. Well, yeah, very, very conservative.
Yeah, it's a little less conservative than you might imagine around here as opposed to the farms around us, because I live in a little town next to an Air Force base. And there's some diversity here. The town's about a third African American, and we actually have a pretty sizable Korean and Vietnamese populations, as well as our share of Hispanics who work at construction jobs around the area and plants. But in a macro sense, a lot of the people that I talk to around here, winning them back, if it's going to happen, is going to take years. We don't really have time for that. We need to build a winning political coalition very soon, because the longer we allow the right to hold all the levers of power in this country, the harder it's going to be to peel them away. And I think the way that you approach it is you give them a positive agenda to vote for. You have to create a little bit of doubt in the population, just enough so that you peel a few of those voters away, relatively few, and a few more become unsure of themselves and decide maybe to sit out the election, which can and does happen. I assure you. We talk about these people being motivated and organized a lot, and outside the evangelical movement, I'd say that that's not really true. They will stay home if they feel like the candidate's not worth going out for.
Right.
And with that, we can probably win the presidency back, at least, which is something. The House becomes more difficult, and I think, I'm still waiting on Kennedy to please find gerrymandering to be unconstitutional. Please do that. Because if he doesn't, I don't know what we do about that. I don't know. Do you have an opinion on that as an attorney?
On the gerrymandering?
On that case, I don't know if you're familiar with it, that Supreme Court case. They heard arguments a while ago. Apparently, Kennedy seemed to be asking questions and making noises that signal that he might be open to ruling for the anti-gerrymandering side. I can't remember if they're the plaintiffs or the defendants, but
right. Well, I think that, I've basically read what you have, but it seems like what Kennedy was always asking for, because the Supreme Court likes rules,
Yeah.
They like standards and rules that can easily be applied, especially in cases like this, because there's likely to be more cases in the future, and it seems like the case that's come before them now has a good measure for what gerrymandering is, and it's sort of very mathematical and easy to apply. So I would think that he would go, find something favorable for basically overthrowing the gerrymandering scheme. And what is it? Is it Wisconsin or?
I think it's Wisconsin. Yes.
Yeah, I'm super prepared, but
I brought this up off the top of my head. I haven't read up on it in a few days.
But I don't think. I think even if they find it unconstitutional, that's a whole process. Then they got to redraw the districts and everything, and it's going to be, it'll be interesting. But yeah, that would be huge, right? Of course, anything to make it more democratic. And you're right, it's easy to be really, really frightened about the fake news phenomenon, but Rush Limbaugh's been doing the same thing for a long time, and so it's not necessarily new, but
no, it's just got a new flavor and a new source in a way. But when you dedicate yourself to propaganda, you don't care about what's true. You just do what works for you.
Right.
I wanted to ask you a personal question, sort of. I remember you called into the Majority Report once, and you mentioned that you were a former man of faith.
Yeah.
You used to be a Mormon, I used to be a very committed Methodist Christian until probably my mid-20s.
Nice.
And it's relevant to politics, I think, because even though I say we are going to need to write some of these people off in a macro sense, at least for the next election, because breaking through their propaganda bubbles is just not going to be possible in the time that we have. But you shouldn't lose faith in the ability of a human mind to change.
Right.
I was more sure that God was real than I was sure of anything else for a long time, most of my life. It is amazing to me now that I believed that for so long, because I believe the exact opposite now, and I'm even more sure that I have it right this time.
Right.
And maybe if from the outside looking in, I might have been the kind of guy to say, well, look, he's going to church every week. He's really into this. He prays. He studies. He's just not going to be reachable. But that would have been wrong. What are your thoughts on deconversion? And how did it happen for you? And how do you think it relates to today's political debates, if at all?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question. For me, I did a 2-year Mormon mission and knocked a lot of doors and pissed a lot of people off, mostly. And when I got home, I went to BYU, and I started dating a girl who I knew in high school, and wanted to convert her because I was still sort of in missionary mode, and so I was sharing resources like books and stuff.
Right.
And she seemed kind of interested, like she lived in Salt Lake, and so she was exposed to sort of Mormon culture and was like, okay, I'll put forth a good faith effort, I guess, in looking into this. And of course, this is 2004, and so the internet is really becoming more like a tool of everyday life, and less like a sort of the thing that you used at the library.
Yeah, it's nothing for nerds anymore.
Yeah, something for nerds. And so she approached me with some things that she had found about Mormon history and Mormon ceremonies and things like that. And I had just been sort of programmed to give certain responses, like, well, that's very symbolic, and you wouldn't understand because, milk before meat and all these different things. And I just remember one day she said, I want to hear what you think, not what you've been told to think.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a specific passage in Mormon scripture where Joseph Smith, who's the founder of Mormonism, it's revealed to him. So this is a revelation from God, right? To Joseph Smith's wife, who has recently found out that Joseph has all these other wives. And so God tells Emma Smith, his wife, that she basically has to be cool with it, or she'll be struck down with a flaming sword, which is like horrifying and absurd, right?
Of course.
And I was just sort of, I think that modern day Mormons have been trained to sort of put polygamy, that's something that just used to happen and it doesn't matter anymore. And I was giving sort of all these apologetic mental gymnastics responses, and she was just like, no, like, what does that make you feel when you read that? Like, what does that make you think? I don't want to hear what you've been told. And I was like, okay, I guess I need to think about this some more. And so I did, and I started to, do research and read into some things that I honestly just hadn't been exposed to before, like new information. and Mormons are very proud of their history, and they study their history very aggressively, but from a limited number of sources. And so they control the sources very tightly. And a thing like the internet has actually a really pretty devastating effect on, I think, faiths like Mormonism or Jehovah Witnessism.
Yeah, or however you say that. Once you started looking into it, how long did it take you to start to doubt to where you feel comfortable saying that you don't believe anymore?
Yeah, this happened over the course of a summer, really, and it didn't take even that long. I do remember feeling, in a position of I don't feel like I can be happy in the church anymore, because I just know too much, and I reject these ideas, Or you would go to church and they'd say, well, this is how this happened, and you just got done reading, a biography on Joseph Smith, and that's not how it happened. And I wasn't one who was okay to just sit there and listen to that. But I also had been convinced by the church that you can't be happy outside of the church either. That's an impossibility. People outside of the church are sort of on the surface happy, but they're rotting on the inside, basically.
Everyone, even other Christian sects. Just curious.
Well, there's a
continuum.
There's a concept in Mormonism. It's a distinction between what they would call joy and happiness. So joy is like a deep, meaningful happiness, a connection with God, and a degree of happiness that can only be achieved through obedience to the scriptures and whatnot. And then happiness is like, you saw a movie that you like, right, and, it's fine. But then you go home and, deep down there's sort of, some lack of satisfaction or whatever. I don't know. But so I was really convinced of both things. Like, I can't be happy in the church. And I just know that if I leave, then I will be going down this path of misery like everyone else. And I don't know. So I struggled with that for maybe a couple of months. And one day I just had this, kind of an aha moment, like, oh, okay, this doesn't have to be true. And it's actually not. And, and then it was like a real light bulb, which now, I mean, and probably for you or for listeners, it seems super obvious, and it is. But, it's hard to go through that and to sort of have it deconstructed. So
a couple months seems. Were you so you're no longer a Mormon? Are you an atheist? Did you consider any other religions, or how long did that take? Just a couple months.
There's also this happened to me, and I've heard that this has happened for other people within Mormonism, that even when I was an active Mormon, I remember thinking on my mission that if Mormonism isn't true, nothing's true. And I don't know why that is, but I do think that people tend to go from Mormonism to disbelief rather than to some other set of,
right,
things. I think just because, I don't know. That's a whole nother conversation, but I went through sort of an angry phase. I think I was bitter and angry about, the church, and I felt like I'd been lied to.
Me too.
In some ways, I mean, honestly, not by my parents or the people who taught me growing up in church. I mean, those are all really good people who were doing what they thought was right. And honestly, a lot of those teachings I appreciate and have helped shape me as a person. But, there's higher up leadership who in the church that was making decisions to have certain things hidden or whatever. And so, yeah, I kind of went through a little bit of a Sam Harris phase. And because I think that what happens is you're going through a faith crisis, and faith has ruined your relationships with your family, and it's a complete obsession. You're thinking about it all the time because your mind has sort of been blown.
Mm-hmm.
And Sam Harris comes along and says, you know what? Faith is the problem with everything. And that lines up perfectly with what you're going through in that moment. Because you're like, yeah, he's right. Faith is the cause of all my problems. And then he says, not just your problems, but the world's problems. And you go, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And then after a while, I mean, honestly, that just gets old.
Yeah.
And then you realize, like, oh, this book was written like without any geopolitical context whatsoever, or whatever. And so I think that you kind of grow out of that. That was my experience. I think most people go through that too.
I mean, the reason I ask is because, I'm actually pretty impressed. It only took you a few months. I wrestled with this stuff. I'm not trying to sound like I have a huge head or whatever, but I'm not a total moron, okay? I'm a pretty smart guy. And so I would think about contradictions in the Bible and God's identity and what he's all about. And I would reason my way out of them for years. But as the internet became a thing and I became more and more concerned with the problem of evil and solving Epicurus' paradox to my satisfaction, I couldn't do it. But that process took me at least a year. Year to go from being a very committed Christian to an atheist. And I did get angry and depressed after that for a while and went through a lot of personal stuff. It's part of the reason I don't have a music degree.
I think that, within the so-called Christian space, there is space for people who want to say, well, the Bible is symbolic, or Jesus, there's writers like Marcus Borg who are like, well, most of what is attributed to Jesus is not real, but we're going to find, parts of it are real, and this, but you can still sort of believe and have this sort of less reality. I don't know what, I guess like a more...
It's kind of like a universalist Unitarian sort of attitude where I've flirted with them a bit and I like them. There's tons of atheists in that church. Where they're just really explicit about the fact that they're going to pick and choose from wherever they want.
But and even like within Catholicism, I think almost every Catholic does that, and there's space for that. Within Mormonism, there's, at least the Mormonism that I was raised to believe in, it's really all or nothing. And there's really specific literal truth claims about the church, which are important to one's faith. So God literally restored his church through this person. And just as an example, in the Mormon scripture, there's more modern Mormon scripture. Joseph Smith bought these Egyptian mummies in Jackson County, Missouri, like in 35. And there were some scrolls, like Egyptian, this is a true story, Egyptian scrolls. And he's like, oh, good, I can translate these because I'm a translator and a seer and a prophet. And he's like, oh, these are the literal writings of Abraham. Like, God sent me these mummies with the writings of Abraham. And here's what it says. And then there's books of scripture, including these little hieroglyphs in the modern Mormon scripture. Well, it turns out there was a thing called the Rosetta Stone, and we like decoded and learned Egyptian, and that's not what it says at all. It's like a funeral text, and it doesn't meet the time frame of Abraham, and it's not even close to being accurate. So when I found that out, it was kind of like, I mean, this thing it's just not true. And the apologetics to me are really weak. And so I think that could explain why it's easier. Although there are people who struggle to do it. I think a lot of it had to do with, I was in college, I was single, I had no kids or anything. A lot of people find this stuff and they're, in a Mormon marriage with kids. rights, and
there's a lot more to consider.
There's a lot at stake. I didn't really have anything at stake, so
no,
I was like,
neither
well,
did I.
anyways.
We had that going for us. How did you become an attorney? And why did you choose immigration law as your practice?
Through law school.
Well, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. It's a dumb question. But
No.
why? You're a great lawyer, I'm sure. But you'd also be great at a number of other jobs too. So why an attorney?
So I went to college. I was going to do design, industrial design, which I did for about a year, and then I got kicked out of this program, and it's a long story. But
That's fine.
when I was in the Canary Islands, so I went there on my mission when I was 19, I guess. And I just kind of thought like America was great and the world was basically a just place. And when I got there were all these African immigrants who like risked their lives to get to these islands. And then they were just treated like really, really terribly. And there was racism and just, employment discrimination and all types of abuses that took place. And I was like, somebody should do something about this. And so I think I always had that sort of drive. I went to law school, and I was kind of originally hoping to get a job actually with the government. I didn't really want to be an attorney. I wanted to maybe, work for USAID or something, or maybe like, I don't know, the Organization for American States and do human rights work. And I just got offered this job at a law school to come to Yakima and do immigration law. And I was like, all right, let's do it. And so that's how that happened.
Cool.
Boring story.
No, it's fine. I mean, no.
I can cut that.
People, I'm a big, I think lawyers and courts are really important. I actually don't really like when they get unfairly maligned as being ambulance chasers or grifters. I mean, there's bad people in any profession, but in this country, the courts are really the last stop that they haven't taken away from us, that you can really find a measure of justice in this world, because our electoral politics is totally fucked. It's not representational. It's extremely undemocratic and arcane, and the wheels on our democracy bus are pretty rickety and they need changing. But the courts are supposed to be a backstop for everyone to achieve some measure of justice according to the law. And when I hear propaganda, really, because that's what it is from the right, about how lawyers are all just in it to make a ton of money, and they're really unethical, and they'll say and do anything for their client to get them out of court. First of all, everyone deserves the best representation they can get. And like I said, when every other avenue is closed to a person, the courts are really all that's left. And they're slow, because you have to do everything one person at a time, basically, with a few exceptions. But they're there for us. And, I just don't see the utility in slandering the practice of law, really, from a left perspective, when it's really the last force, one of the last forces in our country really working to achieve justice for people.
Right. I agree that we are the most important people in the country. No, what I would say is I think that there's a lot of truth to that. The other thing is, like, Jeff Sessions came out recently and called out, quote unquote, dirty immigration lawyers, specific. And one point I try to make is that there are disciplinary mechanisms in place. So, like the Immigration Court, the Executive Office for Immigration Review, they've got disciplinary procedures for attorneys who file things late or don't show up to court or whatever. Every state has a bar association that can also discipline and unlicense an attorney. So, and we've got a pay dues and do all these things. So obviously, in my own community, I know of lawyers who suck and just I wish they would go away. At the same time, like there are mechanisms in place to course correct and to hold people accountable. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a mixed bag like with any profession, but we as a profession at least, do these types of things, whereas others maybe don't. So,
right. Kind of this is, I don't know. I always wanted to be a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. Just law curious. Do you have a favorite Supreme Court justice? I'll go first. It's William J. Brennan. He's my favorite. Do you have one?
Why is he your favorite?
Because I really appreciate a lot of the decisions that he wrote and his impact on the way we view justice in this country, specifically really an expansive reading of the 14th Amendment, which I consider the crown jewel, really, of our Constitution. Despite not being a Chief Justice under Earl Warren. Go ahead.
Did you know that the amendments go in order of importance?
They do not.
Yeah, no, they do. That's what I read that on a meme.
Did you know that the First Amendment was originally going to be the third when Madison introduced it?
Well, they changed their minds on how important it was.
No, I mean, if you don't have one, that's fine.
No. So I would say, first of all, William O. Douglas is from Yakima, Washington.
Mm-hmm.
So shout out to William O. And he also happened to be a pretty good lefty on most issues. So shout out to William O. I'm a little bit partial to Benjamin Cardozo, who he was a favorite justice of my favorite professor in law school. But he also had really progressive ideas about how to interpret the law. He actually, he might have called this a little too early, but he said, gone are the primitive days of formalism, basically, where the precise word was the sovereign talisman and every slip was fatal. So in other words, he was saying that we no longer have to be, he wanted judges to have the space and the creativity to interpret the law as it should be, and not be bound by things like the 1797 Webster's Dictionary or whatever.
The earth belongs to the living, as my least favorite founding father said.
Right. So, and then Scalia came along. So I don't know. Cardoso maybe called it too soon, but I think he was really instrumental in putting forward some of those ideas, and obviously, like, a judge can't change the law based on outcome, but he did suggest that outcomes can help shape the law. So, if the law says X, it's X, but if you can interpret the law in such a way to avoid human suffering on the back end, you should do it that way. And these judges, honestly, like Scalia, who claim to be blind to outcomes, are lying.
Yeah, they're just straight up lying.
Yeah, so.
They don't care. And honestly, the best proof of that is probably the Bush-Gore decision. You talked before about how the court likes rules that they can apply somewhat uniformly because that's strong jurisprudence. But in that case, they just decided that, they didn't care about that so much.
Right.
Cool, man. Final question for you, really, because I know you probably have obligations to attend to. What's going on in immigration law these days? I check out your podcast when I can. I've listened to every episode. Usually within a couple of days it comes out, and I love it. Please keep doing it.
So good. So good.
Yeah, it's great.
Obviously today, Trump called for the end of the diversary lottery visa. The diversary, he meant diversity. He doesn't know how to read.
No.
It's actually a type of visa I've never had the pleasure of doing because it is like a lottery. It's a literal lottery where people from underrepresented countries can apply, and if they're chosen, they get a green card. And it's not a ton of people. It's, like I said, a pretty limited program. But I guess this guy who is responsible for the attack, the vehicular homicide in New York, came on a diversity lottery visa about 7 years ago. And so, of course, we've got to upend this program that's existed for 27 years because of the crimes of one dude. So Trump also lied about, he said that, so Republicans are attacking the idea of chain migration, and it's this idea that if you give one person a green card, the next day 40 people have a green card. And I think Rick Santorum said something about getting green cards for your second cousin. And today Trump said that this one person who came on a diversity visa 7 years ago was the starting point for something like 28, or he said 23, I think, other immigrants. And it's just total bullshit. Like, it's not like, well, he's interpreting the numbers in a different way than I would. It's just the number is wrong. It's unless the guy had 23 minor children and a wife who all came with him on that visa, then it would be true. But what I understand is that this person has 2 children. They were probably born here. But even if they weren't, then he would be responsible for bringing 3 people, his 2 kids and his wife. And he's not, as a permanent resident, able to petition for anyone else. No siblings, no parents, nobody else. And so, immigration is a tool in the tool belt of racism. And it's wielded in moments like this to inflict pain and hardship upon communities of color or other types of minorities, and that's what they're doing. It's really obvious.
The guys at Lawyers, Guns, and Money would have gone so far as to call what ICE is doing ethnic cleansing. Would you agree with that?
I don't know. I mean, I guess it seems like a pretty loaded term,
right?
And if I looked into it, I might agree. Right now, I think what you're seeing is, and again, I'm not comparing modern day America to Nazi Germany, but the problem we have right now is that there's huge federal agencies full of people who are either enthusiastically carrying out terrible things, or they're doing it on a sort of, this is just my job kind of basis. Like, I'm just following orders. And, bad things happen when that's the strategy. I think, honestly, like right now, ICE is still just sort of, it's overwhelmed. And the problem is overwhelming, and it's not one that Congress wants to, quote unquote, enforce the laws on the books, but they don't want to fund the agencies sufficiently to allow that to happen. And so you just have these people who are totally overwhelmed, and they're just going out and they're sort of, they are enforcing the laws, but it's random and it's haphazard. And it's unfortunate.
I mean, it's so arbitrary as to probably violate the Constitution, in my opinion, but the country's not there yet.
I mean, it's, I don't know whether or not it's unconstitutional, but I guess what I would say is, to the extent that ICE is there to protect the community and to, go after really bad guys, sometimes we see that for sure. They can pick up somebody who has been deported 3 times for really nasty domestic violence, and it pings on their radar that, hey, this guy's in the community again. He got picked up for a DUI. And, I'm not pro-deportation in any circumstance, but I could see the argument. I can at least understand the argument that, that person should be removed from the community. Now, I don't think that solves the problem. And we need, way different approaches to enforcement, but at least that would make sense. But what's happening now is, they're just going out and this story was in the New Yorker. One of my clients, she was ordered deported in 1988 when she was 2. And she didn't know about this because her mom never told her. And I didn't know about it either because she hadn't told me, and she hadn't told me because she didn't know. And in February, when they were trying to flex their muscles and show, how awesome they are, ICE came to her house and they arrested her. And she called me from the Portland ICE office. So she hadn't been transferred to a detention facility yet. And I said, let me, tell the officers to call me. This is my cell phone. It was on a Sunday. This is my cell phone. Certainly we can work this out. And under Obama, that would have been no problem.
Right.
Okay, we'll let you go. Come check back in a month once you've had a chance to talk to your attorney. And they probably wouldn't have even done that. I mean, they wouldn't have even shown up to her house. But they didn't call me. They just sent her to Tacoma, where there's a detention center, and she was slated to be deported. And then ICE brags about it in the papers that they'd arrested, 85 criminal aliens, among them this lady who has no criminal history. And she's been here since she was 2.
Right. They've started really conflating this crime, quote unquote, of entering the country or being in the country without appropriate documents, and working without appropriate documents. These are usually misdemeanor level offenses, if I'm not mistaken. It's some of these are speeding tickets, right? In terms of their legal equivalence.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, entering without papers or without inspection wasn't even a misdemeanor until 2005. And so anyhow, and one of the changes that the Trump administration made was to change priorities on enforcement and to basically say everyone is a priority. So with Obama, there was a memo in November of 2014 where they said, okay, if you've got a particularly serious misdemeanor like domestic violence or DUI or something more serious, then you're an enforcement priority, and everyone else we're basically going to let be here for now. And with that type of focus, they were still busy, right? And when you take that focus away and you say, okay, just go after whoever, ultimately what that means is the higher level people who are, stabbing people or gangbangers, the Trump administration, their rhetoric on gangs is really hyperbolic and alarmist, and yet their own policies cut the opposite direction and make it less likely that somebody who's actually in a gang doing gang things will have an encounter with law enforcement. So
because they're all just criminals now. They're all just criminals. So one criminal is as good as another.
It's just one big pool, right? So they're not even ranked in some sort of ranking system. And yeah, I don't know. Basically, everything sucks.
Do you have any hope? Do you have any hope for the future?
No. It's hard.
Honest.
I mean, he announced that they ended DACA, and a couple weeks later, it really looked like they'd hammered home a deal.
Mm-hmm.
And then the deal fell apart.
Of course it did.
And so, and DACA is the lowest possible immigration reform you could have. It's such a small number of people and such a limited benefit and such high standards for getting into that group that, and it's so uncontroversial that if we have a Congress that can't get that done, then it's hard to have a lot of hope. Now, I guess what I tell people is we got to get out and we got to work on 2018. You know, like we've got a district that's not very likely to be flipped, but you know, if everybody who was pissed off about losing their DACA or losing their, you know, having a husband who can't get his green card went out and was volunteering we've got a really good candidate running, you know, maybe we flip our district. And if every district did that, then we'd put ourselves in a better position. But I mean, you're looking at least 2019, right? Before.
And the grassroots is starting to get exhausted, right, on the left. And the Democratic Party itself is really not very much help these days. And I'll just leave that at that. I won't get into how terrible they've been lately because it's pretty bad. But, you know, when you have to fight battles on so many fronts, there's just so many hours in a day. And there are only so many people out there who can devote time to this, you know, because everyone else has got to work and pay rent. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, that's the hard thing when you're telling like a farm worker who's working crazy hours and they're tired and they're not making any money, and you tell them like, hey, why don't you spend your Saturdays phone banking?
Right. I mean, maybe they should, and we encourage that, but you know, we can't really hold it against them if they don't want to. Right. I'm totally, yeah, exactly. I'm very sympathetic to people who are like, you know, and the other thing is that it seems very inaccessible and sort of foreign to most people. I think that was the big appeal of Bernie Sanders. He was coming along saying like, no, this is all bullshit. Like we can do something different. And it was like music to people's ears. And so, I always thought it was his personal charisma that drove his campaign. You don't agree?
Well, people joke about his charisma, but I mean, there is something.
He is a nice guy and very charismatic, but
he is charismatic in his own way. I mean, if he had he could have like Al Gore charisma. Right?
Oh God, I don't even.
There's different styles of, you know. There's like Bill Clinton charisma.
I'm gonna tell Brooks to work on the Al Gore with Bernie Sanders platform coming out of his mouth. I don't think I could pull that off, but.
Well, you got kind of a Southern thing. You could probably. He's got. I mean, Al Gore's kind of got $15 minimum wage seems perfectly reasonable.
It's not bad. It's not bad.
Something like along those lines. Anyways, my man, I got to get going here.
Cool, man. Thanks. I will cut this up a little bit. I'll add an intro at the beginning.
I don't think I give you anything to work with.
No,
but
tons to work with. Did you have anything else that you wanted to plug or say?
I just think that you're great. I'm a big fan. So keep up the good work.
Oh, thank you so much. Stephen Robbins, everyone. I appreciate your time, my man.
Take care.
You too.